Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be able to have the opportunity to give a seminar to all of you today. I'm a new assistant professor here at Iowa State. And so I look forward to meeting many of you in the semesters to come. And today I'm going to be talking about natural and anthropogenic influences on extreme weather events. And the animation that you can see here playing on the screen is from one of the high resolution simulations that I performed of Hurricane Katrina, which I'll be talking about today. So the overall objective of my research is to understand and model the physical relationships between extreme weather events, climate variability, and climate change. And the motivation here is to be able to improve seasonal prediction as well as future projections, and also to be able to provide quantitative estimates of impacts relevant information. So what we can see here, I'm not sure if you all can see my cursor or not. Yes, I see people nodding. And so here on the left, this is showing that if we consider all kinds of natural hazards in the US, tropical cyclones and severe storms make up for about half of the fatalities. And they also make up for a very substantial portion of the economic losses. So today I'm going to be talking about these two types of extreme weather events. So first I'll give an overview of some of the challenges in understanding variability and change in extreme events. And so part of this comes from the fact that there are numerous influences on them. So these influences can come from the atmosphere, the ocean, as well as the land surface. They can also act constructively or compensate. So sometimes we have to think about thresholds and nonlinearities in the climate system. And they can also operate on timescales that span all the way from weather to climate. And then finally, they can arise from natural variability. This can be on timescales going anywhere from 1 year to many years, as well as anthropogenic forcings. So I'll be covering both of those today. Some other things that we need to think about are the quality of the observational data as well as the climate models. So if we think about the observations, the consistent sets of observations are relatively short. So that can be up to a century if we're lucky. Sometimes it's only a couple of decades. It's also, if we think about climate models, it's difficult for them to represent intense weather events at the typical model resolution that we're able to achieve with the current computational power that we have. And so because of that, a lot of climate simulations rely on convective parameterization. So essentially what that means is we have to estimate convective processes instead of simulating them more directly. And that can give us some uncertainty in our climate simulations. So the approach that I'm going to be taking in my research involves looking at mechanistic high-resolution climate model experiments combined with observations. So today I'm going to be talking about two different topics. The first in the realm of climate variability. And there are a couple of reasons why I wanted to talk about variability today. One of them is that it's useful for being able to improve seasonal prediction. And the other is that if we really want to have a complete understanding of climate change, we have to have an understanding of natural climate variability as well. So there I'll be talking about the influence of El Niño's spatial variations on tropical cyclone activity. Then I'll be transitioning into looking at climate change. So I'll be looking at the anthropogenic influences on tropical cyclones, as well as tornadic storms. Okay, so first looking at the influence of El Niño's spatial variations on tropical cyclone activity. And just to give a definition of El Niño, for those who may not be familiar, so El Niño refers to a natural variation in ocean temperatures in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. So during El Niño events, the temperatures tend to be anomalously warm. And so I like to start by giving an overview of some of the favorable conditions for tropical cyclones. So some of the things that tropical cyclones like to have in order to generate and either intensify or continue existing include warm ocean temperatures, at the surface, as well as to a depth of about 100 meters. And that's because actually there are interactions between the winds of the tropical cyclones and the ocean surface. So those strong winds can actually mix up the cool water from below. So it's really helpful to have a kind of a layer of warm ocean temperatures. They also need an unstable atmosphere, as well as weak tropospheric vertical wind shear. So essentially what that means is that we don't want the winds to change too much over the entire vertical variation of the tropical cyclone, because that will kind of shear the organization of convection apart. We also need a moist mid-troposphere, as well as a system of organized convection to provide a seedling disturbance for the tropical cyclone to form. All right, so just to give a little bit of background on this, it's very well known that El Niño is one of the major sources of seasonal tropical cyclone predictability. And so here on the left, this is what the ocean temperature anomalies look like during what we would call an East Pacific or cold tongue El Niño event. The reason why we call it cold tongue is that if we think about the climatological ocean temperatures, they tend to be cooler in this region here in the East Pacific and warmer over in the West Pacific. And so it's very well known that this type of El Niño event tends to suppress Atlantic tropical cyclones. And this is through dynamical teleconnections in which the vertical wind shear is enhanced in the Atlantic due to this ocean warming. But we also know that there are variations in El Niño's warming. So we can call these location-dependent flavors. Some people like to call them flavors of El Niño. So here on the right, this is showing a Central Pacific El Niño event. So these warm colors are indicating anomalously warm ocean temperatures here in the Central Pacific, and the influence on tropical cyclones so far had not been understood. So the question that I'll be addressing is, how does the location and magnitude of El Niño's sea surface temperature warming influence Atlantic tropical cyclone activity, and through what mechanisms? And the motivation here is that this warm pool or Central Pacific El Niño has been observed to occur more frequently and with greater intensity over the last couple of decades. And on top of that, if we think about the future climate projections, we tend to see the models indicating more frequent and more intense occurrences of the Central Pacific or warm pool El Niño. Okay, so, so one place that we generally like to start is looking at the observations. And on the bottom here, this is a summary of some of the previous studies that have considered this problem. And we can see that the results are running the whole gamut of less active to more active Atlantic hurricane activity in response to this type of El Niño. And part of what's happening here is, as I was mentioning, the observational records are relatively short. And it's also complicated by ocean temperature variability in other basins like the Atlantic. So in order to address this problem, I ran some climate model simulations. And so here I'm using the Weather Research and Forecasting Model. We call that WRF. And it's a regional climate model, but here I set it up in kind of a special configuration. We call this a tropical channel model. So it actually extends over the entire tropics and actually beyond, goes from 30 south to 50 north. And so that allows us to simulate tropical cyclones in the full global basins in which they occur. So the model is set at 27-kilometer horizontal resolution, which is sufficient to get tropical cyclone-like features, as you can see here in the Gulf of Mexico, right off the coast of Africa, one typhoon in the West Pacific. And these simulations consist of 22 ensemble members. Essentially what that means is I repeated the simulations with small perturbations so that I could have a large sample size to consider. And the ocean temperatures in the control simulation are prescribed from observations. And it's a climatological ocean temperature that varies by month. Then I performed some experiments. And so I created some ocean temperature anomalies that correspond to the different El Nino types. So here at the top, this is representative of the strongest 10% of observed cold tongue El Nino events, or we call them the East Pacific El Nino events. Here in panel B, this is the Whirlpool or Central Pacific El Nino events. So you can see the warming is shifted more towards the Central Pacific, and it's also a bit weaker in magnitude compared to the East Pacific El Nino. And so I made a third ocean temperature pattern in which I actually doubled the anomaly that we see in panel B. So I call that the doubled Whirlpool El Nino or double Central Pacific El Nino. And what's helpful about this one is that if we compare the ocean temperature patterns between panels A and C, we can see that the magnitude of the warming is similar, but the location now is different. So we've controlled for one of the factors here being the magnitude of the warming. Okay, so diving into the results, here what we're looking at is what we call the tropical cyclone track density. And essentially what that means is anywhere that's shaded red is indicating greater occurrences of tropical cyclones in that region for whichever experiment that we're looking at. And then likewise, the blue indicates less tropical cyclone activity. So what we can see is that in all of these experiments, we do see decreases in TCs over the Atlantic basin. We also see some interesting stuff going on in the East and West Pacific, although I don't have time to talk about that today. But one of the things we want to do is actually quantify that response. And so in order to do that, I use a quantity called accumulated cyclone energy, or ACE. And essentially what this is it's an integrated metric. So it's the sum of the squares of the maximum wind speed for every 6 hours of a hurricane or tropical cyclone, integrated over the whole lifetime of the TC and for all of the TCs over that basin throughout the whole season. And so what's useful about ACE is that it accounts for storm strength, number, as well as duration. Okay, so next we'll be looking at the Atlantic tropical cyclone activity response to the different El Nino forcing patterns that I prescribed in the model. So I've set this up here. We have the control or the climatological ocean temperature run here, and then we're going from less active to more active on this axis. So what we see is that the Central Pacific El Nino warming leads to about a 20% reduction in Atlantic ACE, tropical cyclone activity. If we compare that with the strongest 10% of the East Pacific El Nino events, we see that there's an even greater reduction, so about 35%. But what's really interesting here is that if we look at the two El Nino patterns that have similar magnitudes, but just a different location where that maximum warming is, we see that actually there's a much greater reduction in Atlantic hurricane activity for warming that's located in the Central Pacific compared to the East Pacific. So what that tells us is that the ocean warming near the Whirlpool, which is located in the West Pacific, I'll be able to show that on the slides that come next, that the warming near that Whirlpool is more effective at suppressing Atlantic hurricane activity than the warming of the cold tongue. As you might say, well, why is that? These ocean temperature anomalies are of similar magnitude. And the answer is that it helps to think about the absolute ocean temperatures as well as the anomalies. So here we're looking at the climatological ocean temperatures in the tropical Pacific. So here you have South America, Australia. And when I talk about the cold tongue and Whirlpool, you can see that here. So these blue shadings are what I refer to as the cold tongue, and then this red is the Whirlpool. So this is the climatology. We can see here in the East Pacific warming case, that the response of deep convection, which is shaded gray, we see an intensification as well as an eastward shift. But if we look at what happens for deep convection when that 2 degrees of warming is located in the Central Pacific instead of the East Pacific, we see that there's an even greater response in the deep convection, that gray shading. And part of that is because we're warming where the ocean temperatures are already warm. And we know that deep convection likes to occur where there are warm, relatively warm ocean temperatures. And the reason why the deep convection response is so important, you may remember at the beginning of the talk, I was mentioning how vertical wind shear is one of the factors that influences tropical cyclones. And so what happens is when we get these deep convective responses, it actually influences the winds in the upper atmosphere, such that in this case, the wind shear in the Atlantic is increased, and that's not good for tropical cyclones. And so that explains why we see a greater suppression of the Atlantic TCs for this pattern of the El Niño warming compared to this one at the top. And one thing that I wanted to mention that was kind of a useful aspect of the way that we did the simulations is, as I was mentioning, we looked at 22 ensemble members. And so what that means is that each of them has the same sea surface temperature forcing. So I prescribed that to the model, but each one has a slightly different initial condition in the atmosphere. And so what that does is it gives us a sample of what the hurricane activity could look like for similar ocean conditions, but accounting for the random variability that happens in the atmosphere. And so what we see here, these box plots they include the data from all 22 ensemble members, is we see that the internal atmospheric variability results in a pretty large range of tropical cyclone activity. So even though we do see substantial shifts here due to the different El Niño forcings, there's also this factor from the internal variability. And so if we were to pick just a couple of samples out of this, that can explain why in the observational analyses, which had small sample sizes, some of those were coming up with different answers from each other. So to summarize this part of the talk, we found that both El Niño flavors suppress Atlantic tropical cyclone activity, and the ocean warming near the warm pool in the Central Pacific is more effective than warming over the cold tongue in the East Pacific at doing so. And you might say, well, gee, how do we know that this isn't just another, study that's kind of falling in this mix of studies that are giving us results that are kind of inconclusive? And what I would say is that we have a physical explanation that doesn't even require the climate modeling to be able to understand. And so we know that, the Central Pacific is warmer in the climatology, and so less warming is needed there compared to the East Pacific where it's cool in order to warm up the ocean temperatures to get up to that level where deep convection can happen. And one thing that I didn't have time to go into detail, but I did want to mention, is that El Niño is not the only factor that influences seasonal Atlantic tropical cyclone activity. So Atlantic ocean patterns are also important and can have constructive or compensating influences. And some of the implications for this work is that we can use this to improve seasonal tropical cyclone forecasting. And one thing I wanted to mention for those who may be interested in learning more about the interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere and their influence on weather and climate is that I'm planning to teach a course next semester on atmosphere-ocean interaction. So I just wanted to mention that for anyone who may be interested. Okay, so going on to the next part of the talk, now I'm going to be switching to climate change. So specifically looking at anthropogenic influences on major tropical cyclone events. And one of the reasons why I studied this problem is that there's no consensus on this in the observational data. So it's pretty difficult to understand how climate change so far has influenced hurricanes. But it's also a very popular topic. And so one of the things I needed to do to approach this problem is come up with a unique approach. And so what I did here is I used sets of very high resolution models, model experiments, where I was able to actually resolve convection. And so what we did is we developed a modeling framework that is broadly applicable to many kinds of extreme weather events. And I mention that because I know I'm giving a seminar in the Department of Agronomy, and tropical cyclones aren't necessarily a big thing that we think about here in Iowa, but this is something that can be applied to historical droughts or extreme precipitation events that may have had strong impacts on, for example, crop yields. So I just wanted to mention that as we're thinking about the climate modeling methodology that I used here. So this is work that I did in collaboration with Michael Weiner. And so just to set up the problem here, as I was mentioning, it's been very difficult to detect trends in tropical cyclone activity. So we don't really understand how climate change so far has had an influence. And again, this goes back to the fact that there's large natural variability, and there's also issues with changes in sampling procedures over time. So we have an undersampling before the satellite era. If we think about how climate change may influence future tropical cyclone activity, there's no consensus on how that would change global frequencies, but there is some consensus that the global models and theory suggest an increase in the number of intense tropical cyclones. So just to give an overview of how increasing greenhouse gas concentrations may influence tropical cyclones, there are a number of different factors to consider here, and the fact that they can change in different ways is partly what makes this a complicated problem. So if we thought about just the ocean temperatures, we would expect greenhouse gas increases to result in ocean temperature warming, and we know that that would intensify tropical cyclones. Everything else, held the same, but everything else won't be held the same. So we also need to think about what's happening in the upper ocean or the subsurface. And there's been some work suggesting that those changes may actually have a little bit of a dampening effect on the TC intensification. It's still intensified, but not quite as much. Then we also need to think about how differences in warming throughout the vertical profile of the atmosphere can influence tropical cyclones. And then, of course, we need to think about vertical wind shear changes, which are uncertain in the climate models. So the questions that I'm going to be addressing here is include how did climate change so far, so from the pre-industrial until now, influence hurricanes Katrina, Irma, and Maria? If similar hurricanes occurred in the future, how could they change? And what is the uncertainty due to convective parameterizations? And so here, like I was mentioning, I used a set of convection resolving climate model simulations. And I wanted to understand how robust these findings were. So I considered 15 different tropical cyclone events, and I sampled these from multiple different basins and looked at multiple different future emission scenarios. So here again, I used the regional climate model, the WRF model. And for the control simulations, I set up hindcast. So essentially what that means is I give the model the observed data of the atmosphere and the ocean at the time of that hurricane, and I let the model run, and essentially, it's like a forecast, but we have some information as to what actually happened. And so for these simulations, I have a sample size of 10, so 10 ensemble members. And for Hurricane Katrina, I performed these at horizontal resolutions going from 3 kilometer all the way to 27 kilometer. So that allows me to test the influence of being able to more directly represent convection versus having to parameterize it at 27 kilometer resolution. And here on the right, we have an example of what a simulated hurricane looks like at these different resolutions. And part of the reason why I put this here is that, you know, this 3 kilometer simulation is very computationally expensive. And so the global models tend to run usually at 1 degree. The really, what we would consider fine resolution models for a global model would be more like this. So we can see sort of what that means for our hurricane simulations. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how I set up these experiments. And so like I was mentioning, for the control simulation, I was running a hindcast of the actual historical event. And then I want to understand how climate change could influence that event if it were to, if a sort of hypothetically similar event were to occur in the future or in the past. So what I do to achieve that is I keep that same information in the surface boundary conditions, the lateral boundary conditions, and the initial conditions from the observations, but then I perturb the climatology. And so essentially what that means is I have the initial condition for Hurricane Katrina in the model, but I can adjust the background climate so that it's you know, representative of a warmer or a cooler state. And I also do that by changing the greenhouse gas concentrations that I prescribe in the model. So this is showing various emission scenarios. And so this is the list of hurricanes, or sorry, tropical cyclones that I considered. So looking at different basins, different landfall regions. And this is the list of climate states that I considered. So all of these simulations were performed at 4.5 kilometer resolution. And I looked at the historical, which was, I said again, the hindcast of the actual event. And then these events as if they were to occur in pre-industrial climates and at the end of the century in what we call RCP 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5 emission scenarios. So essentially, you know, as we go up in number, this is increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. So one of the things that I wanted to check is that the model is able to reproduce the observed tropical cyclone tracks. So here we're looking at the black line is the observed track from Hurricane Katrina, and all of these dashed gray lines are from the climate model, and the solid line is the average from the climate model. And so what we can see is that the model indeed does do a good job at capturing the observed track. And the other thing I wanted to check is that when we look at the tropical cyclone in the different climate states, that the track is pretty similar between the simulations. And the reason why I wanted to do that is we want to be able to make a fair comparison. So let's say the track deviated substantially and it ended up making landfall, let's say over Florida again. That means that the hurricane would be sensing different ocean and atmospheric environmental conditions. So it wouldn't really be a hurricane like Katrina anymore. But the bottom line here is that we do see good coherence between the tracks. So this method is suitable for addressing this problem. So next, I'm going to be showing some box plots of the maximum 10-meter wind speed from Hurricane Katrina. And so each set here, so we've got blue is pre-industrial, black is historical, and then the red is the end of the century in the high emission scenario. And each cluster of these is representing a different set of model resolution here, listed here at the bottom. And so what we see is that it doesn't matter what resolution we're running at in the model, we always find that there's no substantial change from pre-industrial to now, and then an increase as we go into the future. So what that tells us is that the convective parameterization has little influence on the sign of the intensity change. So this graphic here summarizes what we found for all of the tropical cyclones we considered. So again, this is looking at the peak 10-meter wind speeds, and this is across all of the various climate states. Gray is a simulation that I either didn't perform or had to be thrown out for data quality issues. But what we see here, if we consider the future runs, is a whole lot of red. And so what this is telling us is that there's a robust intensification of tropical cyclones if we think about the future climates. We also see pretty insubstantial changes in the wind speeds from the pre-industrial to the historical period. So that suggests little influence of climate change on the hurricane winds so far. The next thing I wanted to look at is the tropical cyclone rainfall, because that can also have substantial impacts on communities that are experiencing tropical cyclones. So here I have, this is looking at snapshots of the precipitation following the tropical cyclone over its lifetime. This is for Hurricane Katrina at 27 and 3-kilometer resolution. Here we have the historical, and then these are the responses from the pre-industrial climate and looking into the future high emission scenario climate. So what we see is some moderate increases in precipitation over some regions going from pre-industrial to historical. Then if we look at the future, we see really substantial increases in the tropical cyclone precipitation. I also wanted to show, this is the same for Hurricane Irma and Maria. However, there's an interesting spatial pattern in the response in the future precipitation here, where we're seeing really concentrated increases in precip, especially over the areas where it was already raining the most, combined with some drying in the outer areas of the tropical cyclone. And so if we think about what this means in terms of impacts, I would say that this would actually be worse than this response, because we're seeing these areas of really high increases in precip over the areas where it was already raining the most. So here, this is another graphic that is summarizing the rainfall changes for the 15 TCs that we considered. And here we're seeing, again, a whole lot of green. So that's indicating increases in precipitation, regardless of emission scenario. And we're also seeing some increases from the pre-industrial climate to now. So to summarize this part of the talk, we found that for climate change so far, there is an insubstantial influence on the intensity, and that means the maximum wind speed of hurricanes Katrina, Irma, and Maria. We did see up to about a 10% increase in rainfall, and this is kind of consistent with what we're seeing from a collection of other studies that are doing sort of attribution to climate change using both models and observations. And so this is, if we take those all together, that's providing strong evidence of an anthropogenic increase in tropical cyclone precipitation already. If we think about the future, we see a robust increase in both the wind speed-based intensity as well as the rainfall of major tropical cyclones globally. So this is a pretty robust signal that applied across the majority of TCs we considered and all of the emission scenarios. And we also see rainfall increases in some of the tropical cyclones that exceed what we might expect from Clausius-Clapeyron, which is a sort of back of the envelope estimate of what we might expect purely based on thermodynamic changes alone. And finally, the use of convective parameterization in this case did not influence the sign of the intensity responses. And so, no matter whether we were doing this at 3 kilometer or 27 kilometer, the model told us qualitatively the same thing. And so this is good news because this provides support for the global tropical cyclone permitting model projections. So global models that are able to run say down to about a 1/4 degree resolution. Okay, so now I'm going to be shifting into the last part of my talk, and this is looking at climate change influences on tornadic storms. And this is research that was led by my postdoc, Emily Berkos-Hickey, at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And this was also done in collaboration with Bill Gallus here in the Department of Geological and Atmospheric Sciences. And this work was part of a project that's funded by the Department of Defense. And the objective there is they have a software management system that considers essentially the condition and maintenance schedule for their facilities. And they want to understand how changes in extreme weather events can influence the replacement cycles and maintenance for their facilities. And so we're part of the climate services team where we want to be able to provide that climate change information that goes into this management software. Okay, so to start off, just sort of setting up the problem to think about some of the limitations of the observations and models. This is kind of similar to what we were thinking about for tropical cyclones. We know that the tornado databases have been subject to inconsistencies in the reporting system, and they're also heavily influenced by changes in population density. So that's one thing that is kind of a challenge to addressing this problem from the observational perspective. We also know that climate models, their typical resolutions, aren't able to really adequately resolve severe storms, and they're certainly not able to simulate tornadoes, because we have these computational limitations. And if we think about some of the work that has used essentially larger scale environmental parameters to infer severe storm activity, because we can't directly resolve it, they indicate opposing changes in the future. So if we think of some of the kind of larger scale ingredients that are important for the development of these storms, those are listed here. So storm relative helicity, that's good for tornadic storms. It's essentially the potential for updraft rotation. Convective available potential energy, that's also good for storms. That's the instability of the atmosphere. And then convective inhibition is not favorable for the development of storms generally. So the question that we're addressing here is how would the favorability for historical winter, nocturnal, and spring tornadic storm events change if they occurred in pre-industrial or future climates? And so these are the 3 events that we chose. So we have an event that happened during the winter that impacted Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. And this is one of the DoD sites that we're working with as part of this project. We also considered a nocturnal event, which can be particularly dangerous for people, because if people are sleeping when this event happens, it can lead to increased injuries and fatalities. So this was the event that impacted Nashville in March of 2020. And then the spring event that impacted Joplin in 2011. And so like I was mentioning at the beginning, this is all part of this bigger project that's where the objective is to be able to provide information on extreme weather events to go into the software that the Department of Defense uses to monitor its facility condition and maintenance. So the modeling methodology that I used here is similar as what I presented previously for tropical cyclones. So we're using the WRF model. This is looking at the domains. And so we've got the stars marking where the events had their impacts. These are all run at 3-kilometer resolution with 5 ensemble members each. And we're considering 4 different climate states. So the pre-industrial, historical, and mid and late century under a high greenhouse gas emissions scenario. So this figure here is showing the maximum simulated ensemble member updraft helicity for the different climates for the winter event. So this is the one that impacted Fort Leonard Wood. And so essentially, the important thing to know here is that this variable is a surrogate for tornadic storms. And so the more shading and the stronger towards the yellow end of the color bar that we see here, that indicates an increase in the potential for tornadic storms. And so that's what we see as we go from the historical to the mid-century and especially the late century projection. We see quite a strong increase. And so one thing that we wanted to do is be able to consider how all of that data looks in terms of the PDFs. And so what we did, if we go back here, we considered within this red box, all of these grid points in the model and over the whole time period of the storm event. And so we collected up all of that data and we made these PDFs. And so what we're trying to see here is if there's any systematic shifts in the updraft helicity, which is that surrogate for tornadic activity between the different climate states. And what we see is that actually the answer is yes. If we look at, especially from the historical, which is blue, to the mid-century in orange, and especially late century in red, we see a shift towards greater values of updraft helicity. And so that's indicating an increase in the favorability for tornadic events like this winter event that impacted Fort Leonard Wood. And so this one is what we would consider to be more of a direct surrogate for tornadic activity. This is something that we're able to get really by having the model simulations down to that 3-kilometer resolution. So for example, like a 25-kilometer model might have a really hard time simulating something like this. I also looked at the 3 environmental parameters that I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So these are things that we might be able to consider both in these simulations that are very high resolution, as well as some of the coarser model resolution. So some of the global models, people have looked at these variables in those kinds of simulations. So the reason why we're looking at this is to try to understand if any of these environmental parameters can explain the changes that we see in the updraft helicity. And the main one that we want to look at here is the CAPE. This again is a measure of the instability of the atmosphere. And so what we see is in the orange and red, a shift towards greater values, which indicates that would be supportive for these kinds of severe storm events. We see that the changes in the storm relative helicity actually don't really explain what we see in the updraft helicity changes. So we're actually seeing a decrease in the future. And so to summarize this part, we looked at the anthropogenic influences on tornadic storms using ensembles of convection resolving climate model simulations. And I didn't have time to go through every single case, but to summarize those here, we found that from the pre-industrial to the present climates, the potential for tornadic storms increased in the spring event and decreased in the winter and nocturnal events. And then if we think about future climate change, the potential for the tornadic storms is projected to decrease in the spring and increase in the winter and nocturnal events. And one thing that was really important is that for one of the events, we found that the changes in the large-scale environmental parameters that we would typically consider from a global model simulation didn't always explain the changes in the updraft helicity, which is more of the direct indicator for tornadic storm activity. And so what that means is that we really have to have caution if we're thinking about projections from climate models that don't resolve convection, because those can be different from those that are coming from convection permitting models. So here that result is different from what we found for tropical cyclones, which there really wasn't too much dependence on the 3-kilometer versus the 27-kilometer. So to kind of wrap up here and talk about some future directions, some of the key takeaways that I'm hoping people will remember from this talk is that an understanding of climate variability is necessary in order to understand climate change. So a lot of times, when an impactful event happens, I'll get questions maybe from the media saying, hey, was this climate change? And the answer is not always just a yes or no. Both of those factors can be at play, and sometimes, it might be more one or the other, depending on the event. And then also, we implemented a high-resolution climate modeling framework that can estimate how climate change would modify historically impactful extreme weather events. And like I was mentioning earlier, this is something that's broadly applicable across extreme weather event types. So this could work for drought and extreme precipitation. And if I think about some of the future directions, what I'm really interested in doing next, I found that ensodiversity is an important source of seasonal tropical cyclone predictability. So I'm interested in looking at how future changes in ensodiversity can influence TC activity. In the second part of my talk, we found that intense tropical cyclones are projected to become stronger in the future. However, the modeling framework I was using was atmosphere only, so I was prescribing the ocean temperature conditions. And so I'm interested in looking at how atmosphere-ocean interactions can shape the strength of the coupled feedbacks and their influence on tropical cyclone intensity in a changing climate. And one thing I didn't consider in that second part of my talk is the tropical cyclone numbers. So I'm also interested in looking at what determines the global number of TCs annually. So this is something that I'll be investigating as part of a new DOE grant. And then finally, in the third part, we found that the potential for tornadic storms in the future will decrease in the spring and increase in winter and nocturnal events. And one thing that I've been talking about with Emily as well as Bill Gallus is we're interested in looking at how climate change is expected to influence derechos in the future, especially after the one that we experienced here in August. And has there been any influence already? And from that, I would just like to thank everybody for attending the seminar today, and a special thank you to Valeria, Ram, and Channer. And I'd also like to thank NSF, DOE, DOD, and the supercomputing facilities at NERSC, TAC, and Texas A&M for making this research possible. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Chris.
And I think maybe from here, I may stop sharing my screen so that I can see the questions and also all of you, if that's okay.
I have a question. May I ask it?
Yes. Hi, Brian.
Hi. So what my understanding of tropical cyclones in relation to climate change has been, I've heard that they're going to be wetter, but also slower. You didn't talk about this, whether or not they're going to be slower or not. What do you know about that?
That's a very good question. Yes. So yeah, if we think about the regional impacts from rainfall, it's a function of both the rainfall rate, which we have confidence is going to increase, like you were saying, as well as the translation speed, which some studies have indicated that we've already started seeing a slowdown of the movement. That is one thing that I'm planning to look at in some of the global model simulations that I'm planning to do. One of the big challenges there, I would say, is any biases that are in the climate models in terms of the large scale circulation would translate into uncertainties in understanding the tropical cyclone translation speed. So basically, if you think about a tropical cyclone and the way it moves, the track and how fast it moves is dependent on the large scale, we call it the steering flow. So the TCs are really happy to just sort of go along with whatever's happening with the large scale winds. So we have to make sure that those large scale winds are right in order to be able to assess that for the future projections.
Any other questions?
Yeah, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you feel comfortable unmuting and just asking.
Chandler, do you have questions?
Yes, I might ask a question actually. Thank you. I have a generic question. And what are some of the metrics that you guys use to evaluate your models? Like R-squared value, like classification accuracy, like in machine learning algorithms?
That's a really good question. It depends on what phenomenon we're looking at. So whether it be, say, tropical cyclones, severe storms, drought. One of the things that I tend to focus on more is, so if, let's say if I'm thinking about precipitation, some of the climate models can be notorious for actually, you know, producing half as much or even double the observed precipitation that we would expect. So when I evaluate the climate models, the big thing that I want to see is that they're getting the seasonal cycle of precipitation right, and they're also getting the regional patterns right. So, you know, as long as we see those things, we can then make adjustments for the any sort of like systematic errors in, say, the intensity of the precipitation distribution. Does that make sense?
I see. So are you basically looking at the past patterns and trying to match with the new patterns that you predicted?
Yeah, so when I evaluate the climate models, I'll look at the essentially like the climatology that compares to the historical period that we have observations for, and then compare that with the observations.
I see. I see. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, if no other question is asked, I think we can close the meeting today. And we want to make an announcement for the next week that we're going to be having Ian Williams next week. And he's going to be with us. He's going to be with us next week. And thank you so much for attending today. And Dr. Patricola, it was also great to have you here. Nice, very interesting research. See you guys again next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation.
Of course. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Chris, can you stay on just a little bit longer? Can I answer some more questions?
Sure.